I'm Greg Jones, the senior pastor, and I want to thank you for being here because you care about our community, and that's very important. Any violence in a community is regrettable, and fortunately, Wilmington hit an unacceptable level, and now we're beginning to move away from that. It requires many people in a city to be able to accomplish something like that and to keep moving forward, and so thank you for the part you're playing in reducing violence in our community. Many of you were here a year ago when Father Gregory Boyle spoke. He talked about his work with the gangs in Los Angeles and the importance of building relationships and providing positive alternatives for at-risk individuals. Recently, our congregation created a peace and justice work group, and it is their intention to provide a nationally known speaker every fall and spring in order to focus on violence in the community and also how to reduce and dismantle racism in our community. So it's our intention to do that. I hope you'll keep an ear out so you'll know when we're going to have other events like this. My hope and prayer, like yours I'm sure, is that we will erase that idea about this being the murder capital of USA very soon. It will require the efforts of many, but together I know that we can do this. We're very grateful to have today the nationally known speaker, David Kennedy, who has implemented his strategies in different communities, and you'll hear about that today and the great success that those strategies provide. We're also grateful to have our Chief of Police here today, Bob Tracy. He's known David a very long time and is implementing his strategies, and we're seeing a great reduction. He'll talk more about that. And finally, I'm very pleased that we have our dedicated mayor, Mike Purzycki, here now, and so I'd like for you to welcome him.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you all. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. I think it's a very special congregation with a community mission, a community-based mission that we don't see in all of our different churches around the city. I'm not going to talk to you about criminology and policing because that's not what I do. I get the good sense to hire a coach, my chief, and I don't tell him who to play and I don't tell him what system to run. I just say, Coach, Chief, here's what we need. And I let Chief Tracy do what he does so exceptionally well. In general speaking, I would just say that obviously we've had great success. I'm going to let him talk about the data points. But from my perspective, what's most important is we have an energized police department, high morale among exceptional men and women who do a fantastic job. And what they do most importantly is they engage in the community in a way that confers a certain amount of respect. And I think that's what I want to discuss briefly with you today in my few minutes I have to share with you. I believe that crime is a symptom of greater dysfunction. And I don't think it's reasonable for a community to do all the wrong things and say to their police officers, now you go fix what we have caused. So in the city, for 12 years, we never did rental inspections. The consequences that people live in places that would shock you. They live in third world environments in some places. But we have 14,000 rental units in the city. We can't catch up all at once, but every day we find units that shock the conscience that our children are brought up in those places. That's on us. That's not on our police department. But there's more in my mind that needs to be done. And one seems very subtle, but it goes back to the very discussion we had a year ago when Father Boyle was here. Really, an almost transformative session with my sitting next to him, listening to him speak. And then, of course, I went back and YouTubed him, I don't know how many times, to hear if he had any other messages, nuances on his messages, which I just thought was great. But the thing I remember that meant so much and resonated with me so much is he talked about the concept of kinship. It's a word we know, but it's not often used in this context. But kinship, he said it's more important to live in kinship with someone than it is to live in service of someone. And it was very much what Pastor was talking about when he talked about how we have to live together, that there has to be a togetherness in our lives. We can't learn to love each other from across the street, from across the city. We always talk about we have to have love. You listen to the rhetoric all the time, but we don't spend nearly enough time together. Now, as a conspicuously Republican-looking white mayor of a city that is 58% African-American, believe me, I live this every single day of my life. People say to me, Mayor, what do you know about my life? And my answer is always the same: more than you would guess, but I take your point. You know, we have a certain amount of alienation in some of our neighborhoods from people that don't feel a big part of the franchise. They don't feel like the prosperity that they perceive out there is theirs. We have kids on the east side who've never been to the riverfront. They don't go to the riverfront. They don't feel comfortable in the riverfront. Imagine, we have the Children's Museum on the riverfront, and the kids who need it most don't go there because it seems like that's for somebody else. Alienation, isolation. And I think just like the effect of solitary confinement in prison, that isolation has the same kind of an impact on a community. It rebels, it's bitter, it gets resentful. And the kids grow up internalizing that pain. So I think, what do we have to do? The job as mayor, and in fact every one of us, is to reach out and make people feel respected. So a week ago, we had a college fair for our kids, our students, to experience the potential of historically black colleges and universities available to them. We had 1,600 kids go down to the Chase Center, where 13 HBCUs set up their admissions desks, and talk to the kids about this. 1,600, almost exclusively African-American kids. They were important that day. 650 got admitted to school that day. 200 got scholarships worth $1 million that day. They all walked out of there. But here is the most important thing. It's not that they got admitted to school, it's that they felt that they mattered that day, that people cared about them, that the government cared about them. They were respected. Next day we had the Battle of the Bands. 6,500 people from our city went to Frawley Stadium, no charge. They watched the Battle of the Bands, they had a rap singer come in, and everybody loved it. They felt like this is our city. We're respected, we matter. And so when I think back to what Greg Boyle talks about, I just think that when he talked about kinship, here's what I thought, and I'll just end with this. Kinship means to me is that we're equals. If I give you something with kind of even a sense of kind of generosity, what I do when I give you something, as we all do, we're always giving somebody who needs something, there's an implied debt there, even if it's a debt of gratitude. I'm going to give you something, I expect to thank you back. But if you live in kinship, you're really saying, I got lucky, I've got all this stuff, I want to share it with you. And you don't owe me anything. I'm lucky. I'm just a real lucky guy, and this is how we behave as human beings. That seems what kinship means to me. And so the chief and David are going to talk about some extraordinary work. I'm telling you, I believe we have to create an environment to make their work easier, and that's what we intend to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. We're very privileged this afternoon to hear from David Kennedy, who is a nationally known author, who is a professor of criminal justice at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. He has focused on violence in cities for decades now. He has studied this problem as much as anyone, and he has come up with some strategies that have been implemented in different cities around the country and have proven that there are methods that can be used in the city to reduce violence. He's going to share that with us this afternoon. After his presentation, we'll be able to hear from our Chief of Police and how he has been implementing those strategies, and then we'll open it up to the floor. But right now, please welcome with me David Kennedy.
Good afternoon. I spend a lot of time in black churches, and that is not going to cut it. Good afternoon. There you go. Thank you very much. I am very, very happy to be here. I've got a history of coming to Wilmington to talk about this issue. I will make my way to that history, but I'll just say right now it has not been a happy one. And this is a happy one. I have friends in this room. The mayor has made me welcome at different times. I go way back with Chief Tracy, which I'll talk about. I particularly want to thank Lynn Keelhorn. Is Lynn here? Who really got me here and made this happen. Thank you. And I move in circles where I work with politicians at various levels, and we just came away from a meeting that included a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office and so on and so forth. That's my world. I genuinely think that this conversation and what the people in this room can do can be the most important engagement in this city about sustained violence prevention and altering the course of this community on this issue. And that is not politesse, it's not exaggeration, and I will make my way over the next little while to why I believe that to be right. I woke up this morning to a text message from my Aunt Sally. So she is the last remaining of her and prior generations in my family. She's 86 years old. She is a piece of work. And she wrote my sister and my wife and I this morning and said, I am thinking about your mother because I lost my mother 4 years ago this morning. And my mother followed this work very carefully, as did my father. They were smart and thoughtful and proud of their kids. And they watched the development of the work that I'm here to talk about, and they got it and were fascinated by it. Our first success was in Boston over 20 years ago, what came to be called the Boston Miracle. And we went from absolutely deserved obscurity to literally being on the front page of the New York Times and on the evening news and international attention. And my folks who had retired to Maine had the happy experience of going off to dinner parties and stuff. I looked at them in those days and thought, you have a much more vigorous social life than I ever will. And their friends would say to them, wasn't that David on the cover of the New York Times this morning? And my mother would say, yes, that's right, and what he's doing is very interesting and intricate, and I'll explain it to you. But the first thing you need to know is he learned it all from me. And the longer I'm at it, the more I believe that that's actually really true. And you'll come to understand that as we go on here. But what I want to do is to talk about the history of violence prevention in this city. And I will make my way to that history. And the longer I'm at it, the more I believe that that's actually really true. And you'll come to understand that as we go on here. But what I want to do is to talk about the history of violence prevention in this city. And I will make my way to that history. My mom would be very glad that all this was happening today. And so you've made a good thing happen. I have known Bob Tracy a long time, and Bob is a good man and a very effective police administrator. And when the city started to think about bringing him down, I started getting phone calls saying, we're thinking about bringing Bob Tracy down, and should we do that? I said, yes, you should. He's the right fit for the city, and he knows what he's doing. If you bring him here, you will see in remarkably little time serious reductions in your serious violent crime. As I stand here today, shootings in Wilmington are down over 60% from where they were this time last year. And that means in real human terms that over 100 people have not been shot in Wilmington. And they are walking around unhurt, and their families are not traumatized, and their communities are not traumatized in the way that they would have been otherwise. And this is not to sing Bob Tracy's praises, although I'm capable of doing that. This is to make the point that this is now work we know how to do. When I got started in this 30 years ago, so I am standing here because in 1985, as a young kind of journalistic researcher at Harvard University, I was sent out to look at the state of the art in American policing, something I knew nothing about, something I was not interested in. I was setting up to be a nonfiction journalist, and this was kind of my on-the-job training. And my first American field work was in the LAPD. And at the time, the official position of the Los Angeles Police Department was that neither the police nor anybody else could do anything about people killing each other. They were the most technically self-conscious and sophisticated department in the world at that time. And they had two formal categories. One was repressible crime. And repressible crime were things like auto theft and robbery and burglary, things that a good police department should be able to patrol and investigate and do something about. LAPD formally considered homicide a non-repressible crime. They didn't think they could do anything about people killing each other. And at the time, that made a certain kind of sense. Homicides spur of the moment. By the time you respond to the 911 call, it's over and done with. You can't patrol against it. It's inside, it's outside, it's fitful, it's spasmodic. And even in Southern California, most killers are not serial killers. And so if you arrest the guy, you're not really doing much to protect the next one. And it was official LAPD doctrine that they couldn't do anything about this. And while I was on the ground in LA, this was the beginning of the crack epidemic. We think crack started right across the border from South LA in Compton, California. We don't really know, but it seems like that's likely. And on the East Coast where I was then, I was reading about it in the papers, but in LA, it had just run like wildfire through the community. And two strapping black LAPD officers took me to a place called Nickerson Gardens. Nickerson Gardens is the biggest public housing complex west of the Mississippi, and it had turned into a giant crack market. And I had never been so scared in my life. The people who lived there were terrified. It was public housing, so it was mostly single mothers and their families. The mothers and the grandmothers were afraid to come out of their apartments. There were little groups of armed drug dealers all over the place. There were the crack addicts and the heroin addicts wandering in and out. There were robberies going on of the cars that were driving around alongside. And I had never sensed such fear in my life, not just my own, but everybody else's. You could touch it. And I knew I had no business being there, and that if these cops hadn't been taking care of me, that I would not have made it out of there. And at the end of the day, out of some sense of obligation, I took them out to dinner. And I said to them awkwardly, "Thank you for taking care of me today." One of them had been pretty quiet all day, and he just started to laugh uncontrollably. And I was humiliated. I had just bared my soul, and this guy was laughing at me. And when he got control of himself, he said, "No, I'm not actually laughing at you. Those guys out there, they never ever see a white guy in a suit. And all day long, I was telling them that you were DEA. We're going to have a really quiet couple of weeks. You have done us a big favor." And that day got my attention in a way that has never left me. And I had a non-academic, non-sophisticated, utterly visceral response to what I saw, which was, people should not have to live like this. This is not right. And that has been my North Star for the next 35 years, and as long as I'm functioning, it still will be, because this is not okay. So I go across the country. These are still my issues. I am primarily committed to the most troubled neighborhoods in the country. These days, those are overwhelmingly historically damaged, presently troubled black neighborhoods. The numbers do not begin to capture what is going on, and I can quote the numbers with the best of my academic friends. And I will make my way to them, but the numbers do not begin to capture what is going on. So the last time I was in Wilmington, it was because I was on my way to Chester, Pennsylvania. And I went to Swarthmore College. I could have walked to Chester while I was at Swarthmore. It's 3 miles and change. I had no consciousness of the reality of Chester, Pennsylvania, while I was there at Swarthmore militating against apartheid and injustices being directed at black people on the other side of the globe. I was utterly, completely oblivious to what was happening to the black community in Chester. And the last time I was here, I got picked up. I was driven to Chester, as many of you have done, I expect. And you go up off the state highway on the off-ramp up into Chester, and on the right side of the off-ramp, and it will be there now if you go look at it, is a lovingly maintained street shrine to a dead black kid. And you find these all over the country. They are photographs and never forget cards and empty liquor bottles and plastic flowers. And they are folk art in these great United States, as they have emerged because of the dying and the dying and the dying and the dying and the dying that these communities have experienced for generations. And when I got to my office visits in Chester, I mentioned this, and one of the city officials said, "Oh, was she out there?" And I didn't know what he meant. And what he meant was, that shrine has been there for something like 10 years. And most days, his mother is out there, standing where he died. And this is the life of these communities all over the country. The last time I was in Wilmington, One of the things that was in the air was a recent, I believe, series in the newspaper that addressed Wilmington as, and if I'm remembering this correctly, the most dangerous city in the country for young people. And what that means, and we all know it, and we need to be honest about it, white kids and white families don't live like this. What that really meant is the most dangerous in the city for young black men, because that's what's going on. The national homicide rate right now is hovering between 4 and 5 per 100,000. I said I would give you some numbers. That means, as criminologists and the FBI track this, 4 or 5 homicide victims per year for every 100,000 in the population. If you are a young black man in one of these neighborhoods, routinely, your homicide victimization rate every year is over 500 per 100,000. It's 100 times worse than if you were not who you were living where you lived. And those are the dead. For every homicide victim, there are 3 or 4 or 5 non-fatal shooting victims. And you see them on the street in their walkers and wheelchairs, and you do not see them on the street because they are quadriplegics and they cannot get out of bed. And the victimization and the community trauma is unimaginable if you do not live it or deal with it directly. My office is working in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And when I finished my office visits in Kalamazoo, a group of black pastors put me in their truck and drove me around their neighborhood. And it was a tour of the dead. He died here. He died in that house. He died on that lawn. He died on that corner. The guy who killed him died in that club. On and on and on and on and on. And the pastor who was driving after hours of this finally looked at me. They gave me the pride of place and the shotgun seat up front. And he said, "I've been really lucky. I've never lost anybody really close to me." And his friend in the back leaned forward and said, "Yes, you have. Remember your cousin?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I forgot about him." He couldn't even remember his dead. So I was talking about this a year or two ago, and when I was done and everybody had left and the people who wanted to talk afterward had left, as often happens, in this case, black woman was standing over here against the wall waiting. And when she was alone, she came up and she said, "I want to tell you a story." So I was with my grandson recently, and we were talking, and he looked at me and he said, "Grandma, when I grow up and go to prison," and she used a phrase I'd never heard before. She said, "I like to slap the taste out of his mouth." And I don't think she did, but we both understood the impulse, because that is the other side of this. What the country has been doing about the violence is locking up and locking up and locking up and locking up and locking up enormous numbers of especially black men. That has been our primary response to the violence. I work in places where all the men have criminal records. I don't know if anybody's done an analysis of what that means in Wilmington's black neighborhoods. They have in Baltimore. And the last time they ran this, it would be worse now because it's gotten worse, but the last time, which was 20 years ago, they did this special analysis. If you were between the ages of 20 and 30 years old and a black man living in Baltimore, Maryland, 50% of you were under criminal justice supervision. Half of everybody. not had a criminal record, but were in prison, in jail, on parole, or on probation. 50% of everybody. And what we know now is what we should have always known, which is that there is no community that can survive all of its men being sent to jail. Nobody. Not one of them. Your life is ruined, you can't get a good job, your kids are more likely to go to prison, your kids are more likely to fail school. The community is less likely to respect the law, it's less likely to cooperate with law enforcement, it's less likely to talk to the DA, and we now know that those communities are less likely to engage in community crime prevention, and they're less likely even to vote. And a black friend of mine says, arresting everybody in sight tells you you're not a citizen, so why should we act like it? This is not okay. And all of this has been plainly evident to anybody who looks for it for decades now. And I have friends who get all kinds of exercised about oppression being visited on indigenous populations in places across the other side of the country, and I'm glad they do, other side of the world. I'm glad they are. I get that. I wish that especially white folks cared as much about the folks that are 3 miles away from where they live. When I was in LA, when I walked Nickerson Gardens, the official position of the LAPD was there's nothing we can do about people killing each other. That is no longer true. I have been part of developing the small set of approaches that we now know work. All of them that work are based on what turns out to be a set of facts on the ground about the way the violence happens. We know these things to be true now. I said my work began in Boston. We first saw this in Boston. We were taught it by frontline police officers and street probation officers and street outreach workers. I went into this partnership with those folks believing otherwise. I'd done what academics do. I had read everything there was to read about these issues. I'd inhaled all of it. It was all methodologically sound and in peer-reviewed journals, and it was wrong. People on the front lines know what's going on, and they taught it to us. And what they taught us was, first and foremost, there are almost no dangerous people in the most dangerous communities. And I'm going to come back to that because it is scientifically important, and it is politically important, and it is morally important. But what they said to us was, we know what's happening. Every time we lose somebody, we knew them, and we know them not because we can look them up in the criminal history database. We know them because we are out there, and they are out there, and they are the most active criminal offenders in the community. They hurt each other. They are what my Boston friends called gang members. They are members of identifiable small groups in the neighborhood that sell drugs and use drugs and do other crimes and get hurt a lot. But they are visible. They are connected with one another. This was the height of the crack epidemic, so everybody out there was selling drugs. Everybody's hustling, everybody's making money on the street, but the violence is not about making money. It's only these guys, for the most part, who are this seriously violent. But the violence is about girls and respect and disrespect, and especially what I was told, beef, vendetta, standing disputes between groups. And you can go to the guys doing it today and say, what is this about? And they won't even be able to tell you. They don't know. They just know that they're trying to kill us and we need to protect ourselves and we're trying to kill them. They hate us, we hate them. And they said every time something happens, we know what it was. We're not clearing any of these cases. We're not getting any prosecutions. Nobody will talk to us. We can't get the evidence to go to the DA. But do we know what happened? We know what happened. Everybody knows what happened. And we were Harvard researchers, so we did our kind of thing. And at the end of the day, they were absolutely, completely right. There were 61 of these groups in Boston, these street groups. They had maybe 1,300, 1,400 people in them. If you were a homicide victim or offender, 3/4 of you had criminal records and you averaged 10 or 12 priors apiece. And overwhelmingly the violence was not about making money. It was about respect and disrespect and boy-girl issues and vendetta. Those 1,300 people represented 1% of their age group in the city of Boston. Not whole communities, not young black men, not black males between the ages of 16 and 25, not everybody who'd been exposed to violence at an early age, not everybody who showed early onset of marijuana use, hardly anybody. And what they also taught us about the groups was that most everybody in them was not a problem. More scared and traumatized than anything else. That maybe 1 or 2 people per group really made things happen. So now we're not talking about 1,300 or 1,500 people, right? You take 5%, 1 in 5, 20% of that, you're down to 200 or 300 people. And the violence problem, the lethal violence problem in Boston, Massachusetts at the peak of the crack epidemic was 200 or 300 people whose names we know. That's what they knew and that's what they taught us. And that has turned out to be true over 20 years. Every place that we have looked, every place that anybody has done this research over and over and over and over again, this is what you find. It's the groups, it's group dynamics, it is very small numbers of people, and those folks are at risk. They are, most of them, never going to hurt anybody. We're doing this work in Sweden now. Those of you who read newspapers, Sweden is making international headlines because of unprovoked, unprecedented and unaddressable violence in Sweden. So we spent time with frontline law enforcement in Malmö, Sweden, which is one of the places making headlines. They know what's going on. And in a city of about 400,000 people, the groups involved who are at high risk for violence and violent victimization in Malmö, Sweden, numbered about 300 people. And when you do the long division, it's good to be an academic. I can bring up my phone and divide 300 into 400,000. I can do that. It's 6 ten-thousandths of the population of the city of Malmö, Sweden. So I'm going to tell you what we've learned about addressing this, but let me just step aside for a moment to highlight what I have just said should mean. And that is that if in the city of Wilmington, in the state of Delaware, the conjoined capacities of state government and city government and state law enforcement authorities and Wilmington law enforcement authorities and the DA and the U.S. Attorney's Office and the social service structure of the state of Delaware and the social service agencies in the city of Wilmington and the nonprofits and the volunteers and the churches and the faith-based organizations and the returned citizens, can't deal with 200 or 300 people and keep them safe and keep them from hurting other people, that's no longer their fault. That's on us. This is our responsibility. And if it's that small and that identifiable, and it continues, that is because people of power and privilege and resources and time and capacity are not doing their jobs. And I'm going to come back to that too. So here's what has been learned about this. First important thing is it is a very, very small number of identifiable folks. I've been working with the Wilmington Police Department. When I first made my way into Wilmington PD this time, among other things, I was introduced to what they call their real-time crime unit. It is their analytic arm. It is really good. And I was able to say this to Bob when he took over. Most places do not think about this issue in the way that I've just laid it out, which is let's identify the groups and the dynamics amongst the groups and the key people in the groups, and let's stay on top of that and let's act effectively. That is not the way they have been brought up and trained to look at this. But these folks were way ahead of the curve, and they were able to sit me down and walk through what they know about this in Wilmington. And it was exactly what I've just said. Groups, identifiable groups, what we call impact players, those few most seriously active, they were on top of it. I've just come out of a conversation that included very skilled street researchers, so not law enforcement at all, but folks who are engaging with the same issue in their own way. And in your city, that entire high-risk group-involved population is about 700 people. And a much, much smaller proportion of that is really at high risk, really impact players. I just did that wrong, didn't I? It's about 1,400 all told. It's about 70 impact players. But at the end of the day, literally, this violence issue in Wilmington that has been going on for so long and has made you arguably, possibly the most dangerous city in the country for young people, 70 people whose names people know. And if we can't deal with that, that's our fault. So there's some ways that have been learned about doing this work. And fundamentally, what turns out to be true is that we need to establish sustained relationships with the high-risk groups and the high-risk people. This is not approval, it's not facilitating, it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. But you have to engage with them, you have to talk with them, you have to talk with them again, you have to understand and respect the position they're in, and you have to address the circumstances that are driving them into chaos. We have to keep them safe, and sometimes we have to stop them. So the fundamental picture that's emerged is actually remarkably simple. It's hard work, but in outline and in principle, it's remarkably simple. One identifies the groups. One identifies the people in the groups. One puts together a partnership of law enforcement, social service providers, and community figures. And one constructs these direct relationships with the groups and the impact players and says to them repeatedly and consistently over time, we care about you, we love you. So Father Boyle, who I know and respect deeply, was here last year talking about kinship. This is agape. Right? This is a good room in which to talk about loving your neighbor. Nobody chose this life, and we need both to make sure that they are safe and can't hurt other people, and we need to do everything we can to keep them safe and lift them up. So we need to say to them, we care about you. We want you to succeed. We don't want you hurt. We don't want you in jail. We need to meet them where they are and give them the immediate support that they need in the chaotic lives that they lead. And we need to be very clear that the violence is unacceptable. There is no excuse for it. And when there is violence, there will be consequences. And it turns out that all of that has been understood. It has been unpacked. We've been doing this for over 20 years. We are making progress in each one of those areas. But the state of the art is such that we know how to do each one of those. And I want to take them in turn. We want the community to say, we care about you, we want you to succeed, we want to help you, and the violence has to stop. People will say about these guys, they have no respect for human life, they have no respect for anybody. That's not true. They just don't respect Bob. That's what's really going on. Every gang member loves his mother. Every gang member loves his little brother and sister. There are lots of people of authentic standing in these communities that they respect. I said my mother said she taught me this, and that as time goes by, I'm increasingly sure that she's right about that. Let me ask you to help me out here. Raise your hand if when you grew up you were afraid of the police. Thank you. Raise your hand if when you grew up you were afraid of your mother. Right. Right? That's how that works. This is what scholars call informal social control. And I tell my graduate students, I've just told you that story. I've saved you 3 years and $300,000 of graduate training, right? Now you know everything you need to know. Right? We know this, that the power that governs communities is not fear of the gun and the badge. The power that governs communities is respect for one another and for right and wrong and for what communities and families and churches and schools say. This is how we behave and this is how we do not behave. And safe communities are not safe because there's a federal agent on every corner. They're safe because they do a really good job of governing one another and raising each other, and they have the kind of relationship they need with Bob so that when they're in trouble and can't handle it, they get some help. But the first line of civility in any community is not the armed power of the state. It is the community. And what I want to say about this is that the communities that we call dangerous are not dangerous communities, right? We have the math and the science on this now. In the most dangerous community, there are almost no dangerous people. And we now understand that those dangerous people, most of them are more scared and traumatized and trapped than they are predatory. There are very few predators out there. What that means, I said I would come back to this, this means that we should turn the way we think about these neighborhoods upside down. We should not think of them as dangerous places full of dangerous people. We should not think of them as defined by the failure of root causes, right? I was raised this way. If there's violence, it's because there's been historical racism, there's been historical racial oppression, there's been racial violence, there has been government neglect, there has been governmental abuse. The schools are terrible, health care is terrible, it's a food desert, there's no transportation, there's no work. And let's just say for a second that every one of those things is true. And of course, they're much too close to being true, and some of them are just absolutely true. And if you're on the other side of things, if you're sort of coming from a right political spectrum, individual accountability perspective, it's because the criminal justice system has completely failed to ensure accountability, and it's a revolving door, and we need more police, and we need more sanctions, and mandatory minimums, and all that kind of thing. And let's say for a moment that every one of those things is true, and that at least we can say the criminal justice system is broken. So let's say both of those things are right. What the science now tells us is that despite that being true, this beleaguered and ill-served and abused community is so fundamentally right-minded on the question of serious violence that in the midst of everything that we have done, and I asked the pastor if this is a congregation that uses the Nicene Creed. I was raised in the Episcopal Church, and we recite the Nicene Creed every time, or at least my childhood church did. And there's a line in the Nicene Creed about things done and left undone. These communities did not just happen. We made them. And I said Chester, right? I don't know the parallel history of this town, but I know Chester. Chester did not just happen. Chester was made by white folks. Chester was created as a labor enclave for white businesses in the Delaware Valley. And it was enforced with housing covenants. It was enforced with unfair labor practices. It was made to happen. Those conditions were created. And in the 1960s, it was driven around what is now one of the most troubled neighborhoods in Chester by a black man who knew this history. He said, this used to be the most thriving middle-class black community in Chester. Despite everything, this place was making it. And so they did that. And that was, they drove I-95 right through the middle of the neighborhood. And you go there now, you literally can't walk from one side of what was the best neighborhood of Chester to the other. The depressed freeway is right there, and RIP and murals for the dead are written on the sidewalks and the houses. We made those places. And despite all of that, these are communities that are so fundamentally sound on the question of violence that they govern themselves and raise their kids in such a way that almost nobody in the community is dangerous. We should celebrate them for their integrity and resilience against what has been done to them. And instead we say they're dangerous places full of dangerous people, and they're saturated in risk factors, and if we don't deal with all the boys by the time they're 18, or by the time they're 8, they're lost, and by the time they're 18, they're gunslingers. It's not true. And we should stop talking about them like that. And taking that core moral energy and focusing it on the 70 or the 1400 and making it clear to them that their community loves them and needs them to stop is tremendously powerful. My mother got that, right, as would any parent. Second thing we need to do is give them the immediate help they need. And the traditional idea about this was get them into a GED program and get them into job training. Everybody knew that it's school and work. That's not true either, it turns out. So when you are 21 or 22 or 24, somebody's trying to kill you, you've lost your friends, you've lost your family members, you've been knifed 3 times and shot once, you're saturated in PTSD, you're reading at a 3rd grade level, you've got a criminal record, you're carrying warrants around with you, you've got a child support judgment on you that means that if you get a job, you don't get to keep any of the money you've got. And nobody in your house has an alarm clock, and you don't really live there, you stay there, so you're not going to be in that house the next week, and the phone you've got right now won't work then. Telling a young man in that position that you're going to give him a referral to a GED program and a job training program is insulting. And folks in the service business have said forever, we will meet you where you are, and we have been lying. We can meet them where they are. We can get their enemy to back down. We can put food on their table. We can help them expunge their criminal record. We can talk to the judge about their child support judgment. We can get them a driver's license. We can get them a phone that works. We can get them a ticket to see their brother upstate because they can't think straight until they see their brother. We can get them out of the neighborhood or out of town so they don't get killed. I mean, this is concrete, immediate stuff. And I had dinner with your governor last night, and he heard this, and he said, I get that. I can work on that. And so I felt really, really positive about that. And we need them to know that there is no excuse for shooting people. Do not care one bit what your history may be, how bad it is. Do not care. There is nothing that justifies shooting and killing people. Right now, the legal consequences for doing that are really low. In most places that I go to in these communities, the homicide clearance rate can be down in low double digits. And if you ask Chief Tracy's equivalent, or at least the people who work for Chief Tracy's equivalent in these neighborhoods, what the clearance rate for non-fatal shootings is, they just laugh at you. Somebody did this research in Boston recently, and if the incident involved the killing of a young black man in Boston's most active neighborhoods, the homicide clearance rate was 12%. And the citywide clearance rate for non-fatal shootings was about 3%. It's impunity, right? People get away with it. Remember what I said about my new friends in Boston? They knew what happened, and that's true everywhere. The fact that the cases aren't getting cleared doesn't mean people don't know what happened. It means they can't present the fact pattern that will get a conviction. So if you sit down with these groups and say, we are going to track every shooting, every homicide, we're going to review it for connection to one of these groups, we're going to keep that running list. And in this meeting, which could be held in this room, that could happen, the community says what it really means, which is we love you and this has to stop. The city says we actually can help you in a way that is meaningful to you, and here's what it is and here's how you get it. And if law enforcement says go back and tell the guys you run with, tell the guys in your group that from now on, after every one of these meetings, we will do two things. We will pay concerted, focused, special law enforcement attention to the most violent group in Wilmington. And if you are in the most violent group in Wilmington, things will happen that you will not like. So don't do that. And we will wait for the first homicide after this conversation. And whatever group is involved in that first homicide will also get attention. So don't do that. And if you call everybody back in 90 days and say, we said it, we meant it, here are people who asked for help and they got it, here are the people who didn't listen, and we don't want to keep doing this, but we will. So don't make us do it. It does not have to be federal prosecution. Everybody doesn't have to go to prison for the rest of their lives. What matters is the group knows something will happen and the group members experience something. It can be enhanced probation support. It can be towing unregistered cars. In South Philly, where they made this work, they discovered that what they call gang members were overwhelmingly living in homes that were stealing their power and their cable. They had pirate connections. And the day after a shooting, the utilities would be out cutting off the power and the cable. And people don't like to sit in dark houses reading comic books by candlelight while the food in the refrigerator spoils. They don't like that. And we've ridden with the South Philly cops, and the gang members were coming up to them and saying, "We get it, we've stopped. How do we get off the list?" Only that's not exactly what they said. So it's not that complicated. You identify the high-risk folks, you figure out ways to talk to them, it's just talking to them. You organize the figures in the community that they recognize as powerful and authentic. You get serious about meeting them where they are, and law enforcement organizes itself to do things in a different way. And what we know about this is one can regularly produce sustained 40, 50, 60, sometimes greater reductions in homicide and non-fatal shootings. Arrests go down because you're not swamping the neighborhood where, again, nearly nobody is dangerous. Why would we execute zero tolerance for low-level stuff in a place where almost everybody who's doing low-level stuff is not violent? All we do is incarcerate people and alienate them. Use of force goes down. Respect for the police goes up. People get help. Most people do not turn their lives around. They just put their guns down, but people will get help. And the incredible pain and trauma that comes with living with this kind of violence, we can make it an enormous amount better. We do not know how to cure it, but we now know how to treat it. And it is not an accident that in the relatively short time Bob Tracy has been here, that shootings are down 60%. This is work we know how to do. I'm going to end on this note. And I began by saying, I have come to Wilmington repeatedly over the years, and I have, and every one of those visits has been absolutely infuriating, because in every one of those visits prior to the present company, I would explain to people of standing in the agencies and institutions that are tasked with doing this work what they could do. And over and over and over and over again, those rooms full of people spent the rest of the discussion explaining why it could never work here and why they weren't going to do it. Wilmington's different, don't you see that? It's bigger, it's smaller, it's richer, it's poorer. All that stuff couldn't possibly work here. There's nothing we can do about this. And my personal favorite was, it's not really our problem at all. We don't have any control over it. It comes from Philadelphia. It comes from Baltimore. People from those other places come and sell drugs here. Anybody here heard this? And I was really struck by this, because I was not aware that New York City and all these other places that have turned their violence around didn't have any highways. This was news to me. It was absolutely infuriating. Things are changing here, and that's why I'm back. We have a saying in my office that we like to work with people who like to work. And you have been blessed right now, or you have chosen, so congratulate yourselves for that, people who like to work. And we are set up with them, and we are committed to this, to supporting them and to supporting you. Here's why I think this could be and ought to be the most important conversation that I have around this problem. How many terms can you serve?
Look how old I am. I can serve
3. 3, okay. 3 4-year terms?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Here, yes.
We're just working the framework here. So at most, you've got about another 10 years, right? Well, let's be honest. Chief Tracy could ingratiate himself with any number of mayors and be here for a long time, but the likelihood is that he won't. That won't be on him, but it's not likely. And your U.S. attorney will change, and your governor will change, and everybody who is in a position of responsibility around this issue will change. I did a little bit of homework on my way in here. This congregation has been here since the 1860s. You're not going anywhere, right? I have said a couple of times that if this problem persists now, it's our fault. This issue in Wilmington was never intractable. When this stuff doesn't work, when there is persistent community violence, these days, because we know how to do effective things, when there is persistent community violence, and it goes on year after year and decade after decade, that is the fault of people who are paid to do this work. It is not the community's problem. It is the problem of the governors and the mayors and the appointed police chiefs and the elected DAs and the appointed U.S. attorneys and the appointed heads of social services who get paid to produce public safety. When this stuff fails, it is never because the community won't step up. It is always because people who get paid to do this work do not do their jobs. And the public should not put up with that. If you went to your surgeon, if you went to your doctor and said, I understand my loved one has been diagnosed with cancer. What are you going to do for my loved one? And they said, well, we're aware of all these very effective new therapies, but we don't really feel like that. So we're going to use these other ones that we know don't work. You would do something about that. Communities need to demand this from their elected and appointed officials. There's a new evaluation out from Oakland, California. This is this work. It is not part of my personal portfolio. Colleagues have driven this there I should not say that, colleagues have supported it because the drive came from the community. Oakland is one of the larger American cities perennially associated correctly with high levels of unaddressed lethal violence. It's practically a poster child. They took this up and totally blew it 2 or 3 different times. They said, we like this piece, we don't like that piece, we'll do this, we won't do that. Of course, it didn't work. The killing continued, and faith-based community organizers got their act together, organized political pressure on the city, and went to those elected and appointed officials and said, we insist that you do this. And basically those folks said, well, that's interesting, we'll think about that, we've got some other ideas. And those organizers said, I don't think you heard us. They pushed it through. They put together a self-tax package that established an Office for Violence Prevention dedicated to keeping this work going and raising funding for the outreach and support elements. This was 6 or 7 years ago. Homicide and non-fatal shootings in Oakland, California are both down close to 50%. Arrests are down. Jails down, complaints against the police are down, use of force by the police are down, and The clearance rate for homicide has gone from 29% to 71%, which is a marker of community confidence, because the way you clear a homicide is people tell you what happened. That's how you clear a homicide. It is immoral at this point not to do this. And it is the job of citizens to make sure that those to whom you grant authority and funds use that effectively. So let me end on this note, and to that point. So like everybody else, I have been unfortunately glued to my device and my screens over the last couple of days watching the Senate Judiciary Committee. And something remarkable happened yesterday. So everybody knows what trajectory this was on, and whatever one's feelings about that trajectory was set. And yesterday, two women buttonholed Senator Jeff Flake in an elevator and would not let him stop, would not let him go away. And they said to him, "You cannot do this. You cannot do this. Look at me," one of them said. "You cannot do this." And Jeff Flake went back into the committee room, and now we have an FBI investigation. That's what citizens do. And to go back to where I started on this, that we have communities that have been living for generations with unconscionable levels of violence is not okay. And when there wasn't anything we knew how to do about it, that was one thing. But that's not true anymore. And you should not let your community suffer because Wilmington has highways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kennedy. Thank you for the work that you've done outlining the strategies that cities need to take in order to reduce violence. And thank you for telling us that it's our job to hold people's feet to the fire to make sure that it happens. Robert Tracy became a police officer in the 1980s in New York City. He has served in law enforcement for over 30 years. From 2011 to 2015, he was the chief of police in Chicago, and during that time, Chicago's rate of violence reached historic lows. Since then, some of those in power have backed away from the strategies that he implemented, and they're seeing their violence go back up. When I first heard 17 months ago that we were going to be hiring Bob Tracy to become our next chief superintendent, or chief of police, my only thought was, I hope this guy knows what he's getting into. Well, turns out he does. And we have seen this great reduction because of the systematic way that he is implementing these strategies within Wilmington. Chief Tracy is going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to open it to the floor for questions and answers. Please join me in welcoming Chief Bob Tracy.
Thank you, Reverend Jones, and thank you for opening up your church for such an important issue. And thank you, Mayor Purzycki, for your leadership and vision and choosing me as your police chief. There's so many important things that we're talking about today, and so many important people that are here. One of them is the U.S. Attorney of the District of Delaware, David Weiss. So David, thank you for being here, because David, right from the beginning, even before he was nominated, was all in part of this, and actually has met with David Kennedy and I, and has gone up to New York to learn a little more on how the U.S. Attorney can get involved in some of these strategies. So David, this is not after your nomination, it's before your nomination, And thank you very much for all the work that you do. And I see Dan Logan and I see Jen Welsh from your team here. So thank you very much for all your support. The other boss that's in the room, other than the mayor, who allows me to be here, and also the support that I get to come here, where the Reverend asked me, why in the world would he take this job? I will take it because it's what I love to do. And the person that supports me and ensures that I can do this type of work and keeps me on the straight and narrow is my wife, Brenda, who's here. The other person responsible for... How's that? The other person responsible for us being here today, and it did a lot of work, was Lynn Kilhorn, and she was mentioned before. Lynn, thanks for all the work you've done to bring this together. And then our guest speaker, David Kennedy. David and I have known each other for quite a while now, and the work that he's done throughout the United States and the decades-long work and his dedication to trying to reduce violence and the strategies and helping a lot of cities out and helping police chiefs like myself has gone a long way. David, the work that you do is incredible, and I really do believe in it. We became professional. We met professionally, but I think we've become very good friends because of what we do and the things that we're trying to get to, where we're trying to save people's lives, where we're trying to reduce violence, where we're not trying to do any more harm in the community when we're trying to do this. Do no more harm. And I think, David, you said that in your book. And that's so true. That is so true coming into the city of Wilmington. One of the things I asked is, how are we going to implement these strategies? What are the strategies, I was asked, and how you plan on putting these strategies in place that David has wrote about and things that I have done as a practitioner in Chicago. But I think to get to that place, we got to talk about what we have done in the last 17 months to prepare the Wilmington Police Department and the community to get to a place where we can have sustainable success. As David talked about, we are not going to be here forever. Mayor, I want you to be here 12 years because I need a job for 12 years, sir. But it's going to be the community. It's going to be the people in this room. It's going to be the community that we talk about. That if we can institutionalize a lot of these things, keep it going, then we're going to see the success repeat itself long after we're gone. And this city of Wilmington is going to be a safer and a better place for it. I came 17 months ago. One of the things, on top of all the strategies, my immediate plan was, and I talked to the mayor about this, was community engagement. We are not going to get to where we need to be without community engagement and start to establish trust with the community. And I often hear that we got to regain the trust in the community. Well, we can't regain something we never had. So you start with building trust. And how does that happen? That happens by putting the same police officers in the same area every single time they work. So they get to know the community. They go to the community meetings. They get out of the car. They walk the footposts. They learn what the community wants and how we're going to address them, on top of all the other things with intelligence-led policing. We put the same supervisor overseeing in that area. And here we have Captain Campos, one of our commanders that oversees this area. He's doing a wonderful job. Captain Campos, please stand up. Wilfredo Campos oversees this area of the same officers and the lieutenants and sergeants and working, and he attends probably 2 to 3 meetings a night. If I'm not there, he's there, or someone's going to be there. We are not going to miss a community meeting in this city because we cannot get to know your conditions and what you want and what we need to address and work together if we don't get to know you. And we build trust by getting back to you, not abandoning you, and doing this with you. By doing that, it's going to build trust. It's a changing the way we're doing policing, and it's a start. And we have to institutionalize that. 17 short months. And I'll get into the trust issue and where it builds some of the things that David spoke about and where we need to be. The second thing that we need to do is identifying that small percentage of people, those impact players, that are committing 60-70% of the violent crime. Not to identify mostly for arrest, but to identify how we can get to them to interrupt the cycle of violence that's happening, the associations that are happening, the association of people that have the highest propensity for violence, and just being in that circle, the propensity for violence that can happen to you, even if you're not the most violent one, is going to go up because of those relationships and who you're in a beef with. And those are the things that we need to teach our department about doing these type of things, who we're looking at, not going into a community using overtime and putting cops all over the place, where David also hit on something that we took out of our vernacular. Zero tolerance is not said in the Wilmington Police Department. Because, I don't know, there's zero tolerance, everybody has a different definition of that. They do. What we do is go out and look to see and make sure that we're identifying the worst offenders and the ones that have caused carnage to the community, or the ones that have committed the violence, and we work on them. And we look at all the other crime trends, even right down to quality of life, and we get very surgical. You can't send a couple hundred cops into a neighborhood and not have a plan of what you're looking for, because you will arrest everyone, hoping to get the ones that are doing wrong. How does that build trust? It doesn't. It actually pushes us further apart. And we won't be doing that. We're not going to do that. We aren't doing that. But we will get out of the car, we will go to the community meetings, we will start to build that trust. When it comes to some of the things that, if you've read David's book and you take a look at focused deterrence, you take a look at call-ins, group violence intervention, custom notifications, all these things are great. They really work. And David and I met in 2011, and David had already started a lot of his work in Chicago prior to us getting there. But what we did is we built on it, and we made sure that we were executing it. First, we had to educate our officers and the community. We had to implement it properly, and then we had to go out and execute it. And then we had to have credibility in what we're doing when we put these things in place. If you do things too soon, and David and I talk about this all the time, the mayor and I talk about this all the time. When I first came through the door, I asked, I have a sense of urgency, but I got to practice patience and set this department up and with the community to carry out the methodologies that we need to put in place. And this department wasn't set up like that. Chicago wasn't set up like that. New York wasn't set up like that in the beginning. But I've been through New York, Chicago, and now here in Wilmington. And with experience comes mistakes. And I've made mistakes, but I will not repeat them. What I'll do is I'll build off the things that have worked. And that's what I'm doing in Wilmington. That's what our officers are doing in Wilmington. Get very, very talented officers and leadership in this department. But we have to have one focused mission in what we're trying to do. But I need to educate my department. I need to put these things in place. I need to put a CompStat methodology where it holds people accountable with discipline, accountability, and communication to make sure that they understand what's going on so we can carry out the things as we serve the city. The things that we're doing, we're already set up before the call-ins. If you've read, I've been asked this probably for 6-7 months. People ask, Chief, when are you going to do the group call-ins? I said, we have to understand there's a lot of components that David talks about in his book, David talks about in his writing. David counsels people on the National Network of Safe Communities. And his technical advice, his practical advice as a practitioner and an academic that we're already doing. We've identified that small percentage and the associations to get them help. We've identified the individuals re-entering or the associations of the people that are on probation or parole. And those individuals on probation and parole, there's conditions of their release when they're out in the community that they have to abide by. And they're part of that highest propensity for violence population. And what we've been doing, and I asked David, and David, we talked about it earlier, David, I'm having some issues. I know it's not going to be perfect the way we did custom notifications in Chicago. We're not there yet. I don't have all the resources, but I need to send the message, and I need to do it in a way to keep people from violence. So we're going to do it through probation, parole, or we're going to make visits to individuals that have influence, and we're going to do it with police officers and parole officers. It's not the perfect system, but get the message to say, the violence that you're involved in, we need you to stop. We're not giving you We're giving you options, but we're not giving you choices. There's things that we do with health and social services. There's things that Ray Fitzgerald's doing. He works for Kara Odom Walker as a state secretary. There's things that we can do, and we give advice, and we tell them there's violence going on, you need to stop. And the feedback that we've been getting is we understand we've highlighted ourselves because we self-selected ourselves in the violence, and we know you're talking to the other groups as well. So we forewarn them. One of the things when you read David's work, you're actually telling them what you're about to do instead of just doing it. I think that's giving them a little bit of respect about what's going to come down. You need to stop. You know, we haven't done the cable or the electric. I don't know if the mayor is going to be very happy if we're cutting off electric or cable on our constituents. But there's other ways to do it. And we have been getting that message out. Those are called custom notifications. That is group accountability. And when you start to do those things, you start to work with the community, you start to work with the discipline, the accountability, the communication, you train in your department, you make sure we have a common mission. We make sure we're out there, we serve the community. There's respect, there's procedural justice, there's police legitimacy. We started a curriculum in Chicago that David was part of, Tracy Mears, Tom Tyler, amongst some other people, the community, and it's being used throughout the United States. It's about, first, respect, neutrality, listening. And that'll come back tenfold, because I don't care where you are in your life, or what's going on, how far down you are in your life, or even addiction issues, or how high up in your life. Treat everyone with respect. Treat everyone with respect. When I became a police officer in 1984, my father was a homicide detective in the Bronx. Almost 35 years a homicide detective. And I saw how he treated the families of victims of homicide, no matter what that person might have been guilty of doing as either an offender, not an innocent victim, sometimes we say that, but a victim, and the family's a victim. And he told me, the best way you could be a police officer is to treat everyone as you would want your family treated if they came in contact with the police. And you take that further, you should do that in life, whether you're a police officer or not. And that's what I expect out of our police officers. I expect them to serve, I expect them to get out of the car, I expect them to put their hat on. And then as we move forward with this strategy, they're getting better and better and better at it. And it doesn't happen by itself. If we did not have the U.S. Attorney, if we did not have the state's attorney, the Attorney General, if we did not have parole probation, if we did not have the community, the civic associations, the elected officials, the faith-based community, the health community, the education community, the governor's support that David spoke with last night about some of the things, the mayor's vision. This all has to come together, and I know we can do it. We have outreach workers that were just sitting in a luncheon with us just earlier, what they care about and what they're doing. We can get this done, but we have to make sure that we're patient in setting it up so we build this for long-term sustainable success. And we're going to get there. The mayor asked me, or said that I'd talk about some data points. David hit on some data points. As of today, compared to the same time last year, we're down 100 shooting victims. A 100 shooting victims, over 63%. 63%. And overall crime is coming down. Murders, shooting murders, are down 50%. When you start to see the trust with the community, it's 17 months. We're going to put out citizen satisfaction surveys. We can take a look at that, then measure where we're going, where we need to improve. But those measurements where you start to see that, when we talk about the community trust, trusting the police, that means they're going to come forward and say, we know that you're looking at those individuals, because they're asking us, please, you know who they are, go get them. But you don't arrest all of us, and we're not. We're doing this with less arrests. We're almost down 9% in arrests this year. Why we're driving crime down and getting this type of violence going down? It's a big number. We'll get better at that. Not as busy as the 63%, But right now, I'll take the 63% and we'll work on the rest, bringing those arrests down, because we're not arresting everyone to get these type of results. Clearance rates. David talked about clearance rates. Right now, we're at 62% clearance rate for homicides. That's an indicator that now that we're speaking with the community, and I often tell my detectives and some of our officers that the community doesn't want to cooperate. When we go to a shooting scene or a violent scene, the people don't want to talk to us. Well, if the first time that you're asking the community to speak to you is when something bad happened, it's too late. You're a stranger. Why should they talk to you? Because they are putting their necks out on the line. And if they don't trust you, they got to worry about living in that community. We have to have that relationship way before the violence happens. And that helps with the clearance rates because people are coming forward. I have numerous examples right now to tell you that we're solving these cases and solving these shootings. Good police work, good initial response, but it's being done because the community is working with us, giving those tips. Anonymous, they'll put us in the right direction, we'll do the rest. And because the community is coming forward and saying, we're not going to do this anymore, this is not going to be normalized. When shooting scenes happen, when I first got here 17 months ago, I went to every single shooting scene to make sure how we ran it. Didn't make a difference what time of night it is. I have a lot of trust in my leaders now, so I'll let Captain Campos call me up when he goes to the shooting scene if I can't make it, because that's the confidence I have in my captain. But we're not going to normalize it. We're not going to put the tape up, collect the evidence, leave, and God forbid, if there is blood, we have the fire department wash up the sidewalk, and everybody goes on their own way, and we forget about it. We are not going to accept this, nor should the community. And more when it comes to shootings, because of the good work that's being done. We went through July into August with 24 days without having a shooting victim in this city. We went 31 days with one shooting, and that one shooting victim, we arrested the person down at Rehoboth Beach because two people came forward and said, this is not acceptable in our neighborhood, we know who the guy is, and then we did our job and went after that person. 31 days with one shooting because the community helped us. And the mayor and I talk about this. How many days, Mayor? You probably know better than I.
I know, but it's a lot.
It's a lot. Our last shooting incident was September 6th of this month. This month of September, had 22 shooting victims and 4 murders, and we have only 2, but 2 too many shooting incidents this month compared to 22 and 4 murders last year. I want to make sure we're getting sustainable success. I want to make sure that before we talk about these numbers that it's not just 1 month, but we're turning it into. We started reducing these murders after this month last year in September, and then we had a downward trend that is bringing these numbers to almost 63. Almost, if I went from October on, it's almost a 65, almost 70% reduction in shooting victims compared to the years past. It doesn't happen by accident, and that's because there's pieces that we're doing that David has talked about in his book, the things that we're putting in place. And the end game is to start to have those group call-ins, but I want to make sure everything's in place. So we don't have to look at this where we've come into Wilmington before, and we weren't patient enough to let it succeed. And when I know with all our partners in this room and the people out there that want to get to the same place, we're going to get this done and even drive this violence down more and help those in need, help the ones that are most violent, because I want to help them first, but we're not going to give them choices. We'll give them options. And the community trust comes in. Our complaints against police officers are down about 30%. That's community trust because we're out there engaging. We're engaging more in the community, but we're getting less complaints. Complaints against our officers from within policy has gone down. These are all indicators of going in the right direction, having a well-trained police department, getting to these strategies we know we can do. And I know right now, we can get better and better at this. We are not going to rest at the numbers that we're talking about today. We're going to look to build on these reductions. And when these things are really in place and everybody's coming together, it's not rushed because we want to play the long game and have sustainable success. and I know we're going to be there. So thank you very much for all your support, and thank you, David, for being here.
We're going to open it up to the floor now. If you have a question for Professor Kennedy or for Chief Tracy, I encourage you either to come forward to this microphone, or we're going to have a roving microphone as well.
So I'm not shy, and I hope this is not beyond the scope of this discussion, but it sounds like to me that you're coming to town to talk about, what needs to be done, and our leaders have bought into it, and they are executing, and in fact, you're working with them. But I'm just wondering about what the mayor started out talking about, sort of the root causes of problems in the neighborhood, and I'm curious, do you also address education services, social services, workforce development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? It seems to me that, we're holding these guys' feet to the fire, but, what should specifically we be doing in that area, if you address that? I'm looking at Professor Kennedy, yeah, but, I kind of know what Mike's going to say.
So you've probably picked up on the fact by now that I'm not particularly polite. I will continue this tradition of my own. So workforce development and attention to education and health care and those sorts of things are not in any immediate way effective in preventing violence. Part of the reason that it's taken so long to get effective at preventing violence is that there's basically been two views on what needs to be done. So one is to address fundamental community conditions and structural conditions. One is to get the criminal justice system right, and people who believe in collective accountability gravitate to the first camp, and people who believe in individual accountability gravitate to the second camp. Both of them have an unblemished record of not being effective against the kind of community violence that we're talking about. And on the first front, it's because those efforts don't change enough, fast enough, to have, even in principle, any near-term impact. So let's say the city manages to turn its schools around, right? So lots of people think education is the key here, and I kind of believe that too, so let's accept that. If we knew how to do that, and our record nationally on making fundamental change in urban education is not great, but let's also say that we can do better than that, then the earliest impact that kind of initiative starting now could possibly have is 15 or 20 years out. Because by the time today's kids entering those better schools become young men in their high-risk years where they will no longer do what they otherwise would have done, that's at least 15 or 20 years out. And it turns out that we have to be fantastically effective at those interventions, because as bad as, let's stick with the schools, as bad as the schools are now and as much as they are failing the community, it's still the case, and I just keep coming back to this, almost nobody who the schools fail become part of the very small group that is at highest risk. And unfortunately, I wish this were otherwise, but the same thing is true for other sorts of initiatives focused on core structural conditions. I think it's the other way around. That one of the reasons we can't make headway on these core issues, and saying they're not meaningful, at least for immediate violence prevention, does not mean we shouldn't do them. Of course we should do them. We just shouldn't think that it means that much for the issues that we're here to talk about, at least in the near term. But one of the reasons we're not successful in doing what we want to do with those community initiatives is because the community's not safe, right? It's really hard to get the schools to be better when people are afraid to go to them, and the issues outside are manifesting themselves inside. It's really hard to get people to do, bring work and businesses and grocery stores to communities when they think of them as bad places full of bad people, and they think they're putting their employees at risk and they can't get insurance covered, right? All that stuff. I now think that a threshold level of community safety should be the grounding for broader community initiatives, not the other way around. And I think our founding fathers got it right? They said an essential element of what the state is responsible for is domestic tranquility. I believe that. And our state authorities have not been producing domestic tranquility in these communities. And that is a root cause of why we have all of these issues, not just the violence issues.
Good afternoon. I'm here from Baltimore, Maryland. I live in Baltimore, so I really am happy about your statistics here about crime. And I also work in public safety. I've been working in that area for 32 years, in the prison system mostly. And I wanted to talk about something that I didn't hear mentioned that I think will be effective. It's two things. One is, locally, I think that you all should do PSA commercials that support home training that went on when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. Commercials that support knowing where to put your trash or how to call for resources. Commercials that support knowing where to go and how to get services that some people just don't know, don't know how to find. The other thing that I felt would be helpful from working with work release in the prison system is getting businesses to remove the triple jeopardy stigma of being arrested. There are numerous persons who go through prison, do time, come out. They cannot get a decent job because they always go back on the criminal record. And the employer uses the federal government resources of the $2,400 credit. They hire the person for 90 days and then they remove them for some trivial reason. And the person is back out trying to find work, because when they go to parole and probation, they have to pay urine fees or urinalysis fees, other type of testing fees. They don't have the money to do that. So out of everything that I said, the biggest thing I think is if they remove the stigma from being a criminal, being caught or arrested and having that on your record, if that's removed and they look at the person's ability to obtain a job and maintain a job, when that person is working, they're earning money, they're happy, and they can contribute to their household. I didn't hear that mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, two excellent points. Let me just say this, that I was the chairman of the Hope Commission for 10 or 11 years. I was on for 12 years. And I think it's fair to say we help more men coming out of prison than anybody in this state. So we were ahead of the curve on this. I will tell you, I think they're making progress on that point down in the General Assembly. State law is more forgiving of some things. You can regain the right to vote, which I think is really important for most, for many felonies, although there's some exclusions. I think you're 100% right about getting people into the system, but I will tell you this. It's a mistake to think that that's the only impediment to people getting back in the workforce. I mean, a lot of men come out of prison. We just hired, about 30 men to clean some of our neighborhoods, and they're thrilled to be able to do that. But we only hire them for one day at a time. They're free to come back day after day, but in many cases, if they commit to a 40-hour work week, on the third day they don't show up. And it's just because they haven't worked for so very long. They're just not, or their life conditions, their economic conditions, the place they live. David talked earlier about somebody who lives in a house that he may not be living in 2 or 3 days. And so it's that impermanence and the disrupted nature of the living conditions of some people that wind up being as much of a problem as that is, although I'm certain that that's a large part of the problem. There was a ban the box movement back a while ago, so someone at least gets the interview. We're in a very tight job market today. I get calls all the time from large employers who say, I need people and I will pay them well. Send the guys who come out, I will give them every consideration. So we're at a moment in time when we can start getting some people to work because the market is so tight and people pay well. And so to your point about advertising, I think we have to encourage people to come back into the system. I talked to you before about the kids who don't go to the riverfront. Well, there are a lot of men who don't like to go out to a job interview because they've had the door slammed on them so many times. They're very uneasy about their prospects, and so they tend to go back where there's nothing there for them. We just all have to work together. It's a very important problem, and I take your point. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I have just 2 issues. One issue I have, growing up, we played hardball. Nowadays, you can't even find a kid in the park playing hardball. You know what I mean? After my family and I watched Soul Train, Mom kick us out of the house. Get out the house. We go play ball. And that gave us something to do. We didn't have time to be hanging on the corners or nothing like that. Like I said, nowadays, you can't even find a kid playing ball. I don't understand it, you know what I mean? And I've been in the city almost 70 years. My second issue is I'm an ex-offender. I just recently left Plumber Center. I'm working, but me and my fiance and I having a hard time trying to find a place to live for ourselves. And we keep getting doors slammed. We got the background check, this and that, and this and that, and this and that. How am I supposed to, try to maintain a good living standard when I got this stigma on my back? And next thing, I got this ankle bracelet on me. Now, the probation officer came to my house. He told me, he says, you got to take the device to work with you and charge it up. I said, man, I can't do that. I said, because number one, if the boss sees me in the break room with the thing you ain't charged up, I'm going to lose my job. I get paid by the hour. So if I lose my job, there go my roof over my head, there go my income, everything I got, it's gone. So, I'm in a tight situation, man. I don't know what to do. I had called different agencies, I called different people, and I just don't know where to go. Thank you.
So, sir, what's your name? So, I am going to volunteer the mayor to speak with you. Because the mayor is the chief executive of this city, and I think the city can help you.
When you hear what I have you lined up for?
I'm used to that. So, at least on the housing issue, I am hoping that the city and the state can be of service to you, and I'm going to invite the mayor to speak with you about that. What both of these last comments have been about has been, in part, the grinding impossibility, not impossibility, I will not do that to you, the grinding burden that comes with having been through the criminal justice system, and the way that we have set things up such that what academics bloodlessly call collateral consequences mean that you just cannot get your life back together, or again, I will not do that to you, make it extremely, extremely burdensome to get one's life back together. So we simply have to stop locking so many people up. We have to. People in this room probably know this, but if you don't, this nation is 5% of the world's population, and it puts 25% of all the people in the world behind bars. That wasn't true that long ago. This began in the 70s. It is an historic aberration. It is not normal. It is not historically normal, and is not normal in the realm of developed nations. We are an unbelievable outlier. And I touched on it, not as poignantly as you have just heard, but when we do this to especially concentrated numbers of men in particular communities, we damage them and we damage their families and we damage their communities, and it has to stop. One way of doing that is to reform the laws, and people are working on that. Another way, and it's much more immediate, is simply to stop making the arrests that feed that machine. And you see in Bob Tracy's comments the movement of a lot of police leadership to wanting to use less law enforcement. The Bob Tracys of the world would not have been proud 5 or 10 years ago that they were making less arrests. They are now. This is a sea change in the profession. We work in communities where, as violence has come down 50 and 60%, arrests have come down 50 and 60%, because this central notion that it's not very many people is just rippling through law enforcement. So that's something that we can put on the table. Let me give you my card, or I will give the mayor my card and he can give it to you. There is an organization in New York called Just Leadership that I would encourage you to get involved with. They are doing activism and political training and capacity building for returned citizens populations all over the country. And it will not be of immediate assistance, but it is a networking and activist opportunity that I would encourage you to look at.
My name's Vernon Knight. I moved here from Washington, D.C. about, it's been 10 weeks. But there are programs in D.C., let's say Child and Family Services. I also work with some advocates there and legal justice, paralegal per se. But in Child and Family Services, what we worked against was, let's say the female gets pregnant by the dude. She goes to Child and Family Services to get a check. Now, what we found, and we had a problem with that, so we filed papers in the court. Because what Child and Family Services did say, look, tell you what, we'll give you a check, but he can't come to your house. Okay? And then we worked with the thing about guys going to jail with teens at young ages, like 20, 21. It was mandatory when they came out that they had to go back and they had to get a GED. There were certain programs that were set up that it mandated this part of their parole, which opened up the economic divide for them. The other thing was that they had officer friendly, because you're talking about kids that are coming up in, like you said, 30, 40 years. So you made them more so comfortable with telling police what was going on in the neighborhood, because those are the same kids that hear everything else. But at the same time, you got, I also worked, I was a property manager, area manager, operations manager, all that. But to make a long story short, I ran a project of 400 units. The biggest problem that I had was the fact that I had young mothers that had kids. And a lot of those kids are like 15, 16, 17. Give you an example. I met with a lady, I talked to her for years, and I got her on track. But when you have 4 kids at 19, and you don't have a GED, No man is going to stay with you and help you raise those kids. So now the whole thing we had to teach people was this here. When you got kids that are that old, you can take care of them off a welfare check because the clothes cost what, $5, $6, baby's clothes cost $2. But the thing we had to ingrain in their head was one thing. When that child gets 12, 13, 14, and 15, he wants a pair of Jordans. You can't afford Jordans. So now what you're going to do is you're going to send your child out there to be killed by somebody for a pair of Jordans. So what we did is try to get them to understand one thing. If you can't support them, try not to have them because they're going to end up in the system or they're going to end up in jail. So we set up certain little things in certain schools for after school for adults, those young mothers, to try to teach them how to be mothers. Because a lot of those kids, they don't know what it is to be a mother because they came from broken homes too. So it's setting something up for them where they can at least have an idea. You got mothers dragging kids down the street. If you don't walk up, I'm going to kick your butt. The baby's legs are this big, you can't keep up. You're talking about kids or babies raising babies, so they're going to end up in the system or they're going to end up dead. That's what we did in D.C., so I work with a lot of groups like that.
Thank you.
I agree with just about everything that you're saying except for one thing, and that is that whole business about education. Everything happens and it has an origin. Okay, I'm not saying that the violence that we're experiencing now is not the result of a whole lot of stuff. I get tired of hearing terms like children don't learn because of poverty or they're at risk. Tired of it. What we need to really look at, to my way of thinking, is what do you mean by violence? There's violence in public schools. I'm not talking about stabbings or shootings. But I'm in 3rd grade and I can't read. I'm in 12th grade, I get a diploma and I still can't read. That's violence to me.
Mayor, Chief, you know, I've been working in crime prevention for over 45 years in this city. I used to walk the streets 45 years ago with a group called Black Man's Volunteer Army Liberation Black Man's Development Center. And we reduced crime in this city by 35 to 45%, according to Chief McCool statistics at that time. If you know Chief McCool, that was 1970. When I was chairman of the board of the Wilmington Housing Authority, we had a drug elimination grant 20 years ago that we put officers in the so-called hot spots, and we reduced crime by 25 to 35%. The city statistics told us that. My problem with my hometown city, I'm a veteran. I have never been in jail. I've been married for 48 years. I got 24 grandchildren and 15 great-grandchildren. I'm an imam at the Muslim Center of Wilmington. We must understand that the root problems in my community is poverty. And if you look at the world situation where young people are going against the governments all around the world, it's still poverty. We're missing the main issue of the poverty. Ms. Beebe said about the education, that's a part of it, and it's a conglomerate of problems. But if we don't get to know one another, I got a saying that Captain Akil always laughs when I said, the problems that we're facing in the world today is un-American and unpatriotic according to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights of this country. If we really understood the First Amendment to this country, if we really understood what chattel slavery has done, when Willie Lynch said he came up the St. James River and said that he saw black people hanging from the trees and that you're wasting your time killing them, I can give you a plan that will last from 100 to 1,000 years, and that is make the dark ones look at the the lighter ones bad shape, look, the short ones look at each other and with negativity, look at the parents, the mother and the wife and the family look at each other with negativity. That's what's happening in my community. I've been going in and out of the prisons in the state for over 45 years. We're now involved in intervention. My co-worker, Muhammad